of the little things that I love in The Lord of the Rings is something that Gollum says to Frodo. And no, I don't feel this way just because I like doing the Gollum voice. No, my precious, no, no. I mean, no, that's not it. I really do like this moment, which is kind of a throwaway comment by Gollum, a thing that he says amid all of the other things that he says, so fast and furiously, in that voice, one of the hints dropped among the snarls, as Gandalf says, referring to the talk of Gollum that he, Gandalf, had weary days of. And this thing that he says has very deep importance to Gollum, and is very powerful, since it refers to what he has gone through, which is considerable. And it also gets me thinking about something that I really never had before. To start, though, it must be understood what Gollum has been through already. He was in possession of the ring for over 500 years. According to the Tale of Years, he gets it, by killing his cousin Diego, in the year 2463. After learning of the ring's ability to make him invisible, a knowledge he put to crooked and malicious uses, he became very unpopular and was shunned when visible by all his relations. They kicked him, and he bit their feet. He took to thieving and going about muttering to himself and gurgling in his throat. So they called him Gollum and cursed him. By 2470, he is living under the Misty Mountains, killing fish and the occasional goblin, while the possession of the ring becomes all-consuming. Gandalf uses the word devouring as to what the ring does to him, and that's pretty spot on. Then, along comes Bilbo, finding the ring and taking off with it. This act by Thief Baggins draws Gollum out from his dwelling at the roots of the mountain in search of his precious. His longing for the ring, Gandalf says, proved stronger than his fear of the orcs or even of the light. But as Gandalf goes on, we learn that Gollum did not find Bilbo or seek out the Shire, but instead, I am afraid there is no possible doubt, he had made his slow, sneaking way, step by step, mile by mile, south, down at last to the land of Mordor. Yes, to Mordor, said Gandalf. Alas, Mordor draws all wicked things, and the dark power was bending all its will to gather them there. The ring of the enemy would leave its mark too, leave him open to the summons. Wretched fool! In that land he would learn much too much for his comfort, and sooner or later, as he lurked and pried on the borders, he would be caught and taken for examination. Gandalf says that when Aragorn eventually found Gollum, by a stinking pool near the Dead Marshes, Gollum had already been there long, meaning in Mordor. The Tale of Years indicates that sometime around 3009, Gollum himself ventured into Mordor and was captured by Sauron, eventually being released in 3017. So about 8 years under Sauron's tender care, enduring what Gandalf calls an examination. What this can be, we can only guess. The movies make it clear that torture was involved, and there's no reason to suspect anything less. Gandalf teases this possibility when he relates his and Aragorn's experiences with the captured Gollum to Frodo. When we pressed him, he whined and cringed and rubbed his long hands, licking his fingers as if they pained him, as if he remembered some old torture. Now, this could be from something else, of course, but it doesn't seem likely. He was in Mordor, after all. And while we don't have any evidence of anyone else getting tortured in Mordor, we do have something from the original manuscript of The Lord of the Rings, which might aid us here. This is revealed in The Return of the Shadow, which is the first volume of Christopher Tolkien's examination of the development of the trilogy. And the person involved is named Trotter, who is the Hobbit Ranger who stood in Aragorn's place for a long time during Tolkien's early writing of the book, and who is notable for, among other things, his wooden shoes. As the hunt for Gollum is revealed in its original form, we read, "Thus it was that Frodo learned how Trotter had tracked Gollum as he wandered southwards through Fangorn Forest and past the dead marshes until he had himself been caught and imprisoned by the Dark Lord. Ever since I have worn shoes," said Trotter with a shudder, and though he said no more, Frodo knew that he had been tortured and his feet hurt in some way. As if that weren't bad enough, Christopher footnotes that passage with the following. "My father bracketed the passage, 'Ever since I have worn shoes,' to 'hurt in some way,' and wrote in the margin, with a query, that it should be revealed later that Trotter had wooden feet." So, they mean business down in Mordor, and I don't think Gollum would have gotten off easily. Gandalf hints at the levels of harm which Frodo might have been victim to. In talking to the recovering Frodo in Rivendell, we read, "They," the Nazgul, "tried to pierce you with a Morgul knife, which remains in the wound. If they had succeeded, you would have become like they are, only weaker and under their command. You would have become a wraith under the dominion of the Dark Lord, and he would have tormented you for trying to keep his ring." Tormented might not be tortured, but it does seem a little more serious than merely examined. At the Council of Elrond, we get Gandalf giving a little less understatement about what happened to Gollum, but he's still a little cryptic. It is beyond all doubt that he went to Mordor, and there all he knew was forced from him. Gollum's own words are both cryptic and understated too, but they are, at least, my little moment that I'm finally getting to. We are well into the Two Towers when it happens, and Frodo and Sam have joined forces with Gollum, and at this point we are listening to them discussing Minas Morgul, the city formerly known as Minas Ithil, or the Tower of the Moon, Isildur's city. Gollum's emphasis will eventually be on the stairs, which lead up and over that city, and which will allow Frodo to enter Mordor in a much less obvious fashion than through the city itself. In the middle of that discussion, though, we have this.
"Tales out of the south," Gollum went on again, "about tall men with the shining eyes, and their houses like hills of stone, and the silver crown of their king and his white tree. Wonderful tales. Oh, yes, there were many tales about the Tower of the Moon."
"That would be Minas Ithil, that Isildur the son of Elendil built," said Frodo. "It was Isildur who cut off the finger of the enemy."
"Yes, he has only 4 on the black hand, but they are enough," said Gollum, shuddering. "And he hated Isildur's city."
And it's Gollum's comment there, but really that shudder, not unlike Trotter's, that really sticks with me. Gollum is rattling off facts of what he knows, or has learned, about the area south of where he and Frodo and Sam happen to be, which right now is just outside of the Black Gate. And this is probably a mix of what he has picked up from having traveled in that region, as well as things he learned of in his youth, since his people come from that area. And maybe, too, stuff he found out during his captivity. Who can say? The history of Elendil and Gil-galad and the One Ring is known to all the wise, says Gandalf at the council. But clearly Gollum knows a thing or two, too. And his comment about Sauron and his Black Hand could be taken from that prior knowledge of his. Gollum extrapolating the missing appendage from the history he has learned. However, that comment, along with that shudder, could mean, and I think very likely does mean, that he is speaking from direct personal knowledge. Meaning that he, Gollum, of all the people in the book, has seen Sauron with his own eyes. If he just said it, that would be one thing. But it's that shudder that he gives, which says, to me anyway, that yes, Sauron was personally involved in the examination of Gollum in Mordor. Or, more properly stated, the torment he would have received from having possessed Sauron's ring, and where all he knew was forced from him. I think the odds are very good that Sauron would want to be there, to personally extract from whomever it is what was done with his ring. Because, given the power of the ring itself, and the untrustworthy nature of orcs and other servants within Sauron's orbit, I'm not sure he would want too many others to know what this least of all rings, as it is called at one point by one of Sauron's messengers, really is, and what it can do. So, it would make sense that he be there personally to examine, to torment, to force, and get the answers he needs without revealing too much to others. No doubt doing to Gollum what Sam does to him later. With his left hand he drew back Gollum's head by his thin, lank hair, stretching his long neck and forcing his pale, venomous eyes to stare up at the sky. Only Sauron is going to be much more menacing than Sam was, I'm pretty sure. So, it's here that pity for Gollum, if we didn't have it already, really needs to make itself known. Seriously, he was tortured by Sauron himself. Poor Smeagol. But it's not just this revelation, which could be just an assumption on my part, I admit it, that I find fascinating in this exchange between Gollum and Frodo. There's an extra something going on, which is what I was referring to earlier as a thing that had never occurred to me before. Gollum's words bring up the fact of Sauron losing a finger during his final battle, which, curiously, is something that isn't explicitly noted in any account of that moment. Check it out. This is Gandalf to Frodo in the Shadow of the Past chapter. It was Gil-galad, Elven King, and Elendil of Westerness, who overthrew Sauron, though they themselves perished in the deed. And Isildur, Elendil's son, cut the ring from Sauron's hand and took it for his own. And this is Elrond in the Council. I beheld the last combat on the slopes of Orodruin, where Gil-galad died, and Elendil fell, and Narsil broke beneath him. But Sauron himself was overthrown, and Isildur cut the ring from his hand with the hilt shard of his father's sword, and took it for his own. And for completeness' sake, here's this moment as it appears in the Silmarillion. Then Gil-galad and Elendil passed into Mordor, and encompassed the stronghold of Sauron, and they laid siege to it for 7 years. But at the last the siege was so strait that Sauron himself came forth, and he wrestled with Gil-galad and Elendil, and they were both slain, and the sword of Elendil broke under him as he fell. But Sauron also was thrown down, and with the hilt shard of Narsil, Isildur cut the ruling ring from the hand of Sauron and took it for his own. These all make plain that things happen differently from the movie. Sauron is already down and out when Isildur cuts the ring from his hand. And I suppose cutting a ring from anybody's hand would indicate taking the finger off with it. But I find it curious that it's only Frodo who makes the distinction. It was Isildur who cut off the finger of the enemy. And after he says that, we then have Gollum's confirmation of that very fact. He having actually seen Sauron's black hand and its 4 fingers. And it's the fact of those 4 fingers which got me thinking. There actually is one other character in the book who has 4 fingers on one hand. Or will have 4 fingers, eventually. And that is Frodo. Funny thing, that. Because apart from sharing missing fingers, Frodo and Sauron also have the distinction of being the only two people in the book who are called the Lord of the Ring. That actually happens in the same place, after Frodo's recovery in Rivendell. We read of Frodo that he found his friends sitting in a porch on the side of the house looking east. "Hooray!" cried Pippin, springing up. "Here is our noble cousin. Make way for Frodo, Lord of the Ring!" Which, for Pippin, goes over about as well as dropping a stone down a well in the middle of Moria. "Hush!" said Gandalf from the shadows at the back of the porch. "Evil things do not come into this valley. But all the same, we should not name them. The Lord of the Ring is not Frodo, but the master of the Dark Tower of Mordor, whose power is again stretching out over the world." Of course, Gandalf breaks his own rule of not bringing evil things into the valley by using the black speech at the council.
Ashnas Gurbaturuk, Ashnas Grimpatul, Ashnas Rakaturuk, Akburzanishi, Kimpatul.
Never before has any voice dared to utter words of that tongue in Imladris, Gandalf the Grey, scolds Elrond. Be that as it may, though, apart from a letter which Tolkien wrote in August of 1938, where he notes, "I have begun again on the sequel to The Hobbit, The Lord of the Ring," that exchange between Pippin and Gandalf is the only time where the book's title, or Sauron himself, or anyone, is referred to as the Lord of the Ring, singular. It should be noted, too, that Sauron is only ever called the Lord of the Rings, plural, just once in the book, as opposed to the twice that the singular Lord of the Ring is used. That usage is by Gandalf as well, who tells Frodo that the Black Riders are the Ringwraiths, the 9 servants of the Lord of the Rings. Before this, they were always just called servants of the enemy. So, just in case there was any doubt as to who the Lord of the Rings is, this passage should dispel it. Which, I suppose, means we have to acknowledge the fact that this book that we all love so much, and the movie series that came from it, and the earlier movie, and all the ancillary products that have come out and continue to come out, are named after the bad guy. Yes, The Lord of the Rings is not just some generic title for a book. It refers to Sauron, the enemy. And while some folks have made a big deal of this, I really don't stress about it very much. There have been an awful lot of books named after their respective bad guys. For me, Dracula comes immediately to mind, as does Moby Dick. Although, I guess it could be argued that Dracula is a tragic hero and Moby Dick is just a whale. But if you want to argue it like that, then Captain Ahab, in the Moby Dick example, could be considered the real bad guy there. Although I think the case could be made that he too is a tragic hero. Either way, Frankenstein is a bit of a bad guy, and he's got a book named after him. And of course, it does refer to the doctor, Victor Frankenstein, and not the monster. Although the doctor is the real monster here in many ways. But again, is much more of the bad guy than anyone else in that book. Meanwhile, there are no less than 3 James Bond novels named after their villains: Dr. No, Goldfinger, and The Man with the Golden Gun. And there are more than a dozen books in the Fu Manchu series, who is decidedly not the good guy there. The Picture of Dorian Gray and The Hound of the Baskervilles are also named for their respective villains, and likewise use a preposition to do so, like the Lord of the Rings. The point is that it isn't outrageous that the Lord of the Rings is named after Sauron. I would say the name is appropriate since Sauron is the chief instigator of the action, and the reason for everything that goes on within the book's 1,000 plus pages, depending on your edition. And frankly, it's a more substantial and ominous sounding phrase than Tolkien's original title for his Hobbit sequel, which was The Magic Ring. The title which Frodo gives the work that he eventually writes, and which in the great meta sense is the book that Tolkien is merely a translator of, is a bit more descriptive. The Downfall of the Lord of the Rings and the Return of the King is what he calls his book, in much the same way that Bilbo's book, which is translated into The Hobbit by Tolkien, again in the great meta sense, is actually called There and Back Again, A Hobbit's Holiday. But the downfall of The Lord of the Rings and The Return of the King is a bit of a mouthful, as is There and Back Again, A Hobbit's Holiday. So it's only natural that a little truncation be applied, at least with The Lord of the Rings. And it's interesting to think of this in Pippin terms, and apply the Lord of the Rings appellation to Frodo rather than Sauron. Although that doesn't really work, since Frodo was hardly a lord, just a hobbit, and he is in possession of only one ring. On the other hand, however many fingers that might happen to have, if he had the power to actually be a lord of that ring, he would have commanded all of the other rings. So the name would actually apply. In which case, the Lord of the Rings would refer to the hero of the book rather than its villain, right? Well, that doesn't really work either, since Frodo may be one of the heroes, but in Tolkien's own words, in Letter 131, Sam is the book's chief hero. But the fact is that whoever possesses the One Ring would eventually become overwhelmed by the power of it, or more specifically, the power of Sauron. For he made that ring himself. It is his, and he let a great part of his own former power pass into it, so that he could rule all the others. Which would turn Frodo, or anyone, into the ultimate villain still. As to that villain, and the title of the work which is named after him, you really do have to think to realize that The Lord of the Rings means Sauron. And I think that that is interesting as well as powerful in its own right, because it means that that phrase is not immediately definitive, and in that way diminishes Sauron to some degree. And if you think about it, it's actually a kind of sarcastic dig, too. I mean, Sauron, which is not even his real name, by the way, it's just what the elves dubbed him. Sauron meaning the abhorred. Sauron is not really the Lord of the Rings. He would be the Lord of the Rings if he had the One Ring. Which gets us back to that four-fingered hand of his that Gollum calls out. Because for Sauron, his lack of a finger can only be a constant reminder of his loss in battle against Elendil and Gil-galad, as well as the loss of that great part of his strength, his precious, the One Ring to rule them all. I mean, my goodness, it should be sitting on his finger right now. And not only isn't it doing that, he doesn't even have a finger on which for it to sit. It's a little like Morgoth, the Dark Lord of the First Age, of whom Sauron was but a servant. He takes hold of the Silmarils, those brightest of all jewels, which were hallowed so that thereafter no mortal flesh, nor hands unclean, nor anything of evil will might touch them, but it was scorched and withered. And so his hands were burned black by the touch of those hallowed jewels, and black they remained ever after, nor was he ever free from the pain of the burning and the anger of the pain. Morgoth, therefore, may wear them in the iron crown on his head, but he cannot forget the price he paid to get them. Sauron, too, then, must feel his loss every day, as he can't help but note that missing finger of his. On the other hand, and yes, I did just say that again, Frodo and his missing finger mean a completely different thing. Yes, as he tries to live out his life in the Shire after the events of the book which does not bear his name, the loss of the finger is part of his ailments. There is no real going back, he says to Gandalf. Though I may come to the Shire, it will not seem the same, for I shall not be the same. I am wounded with knife, sting, and tooth, and a long burden. Where shall I find rest? The tooth, of course, refers to Gollum's biting off of that finger. Frodo also says later to Sam, "I am wounded, wounded. It will never really heal." But, the eventual pain aside, the absence of his finger is not a sign of a loss, but a sign of victory. He and it are exalted. On the field of Cormallen, after the ring's destruction, we read, "And when the glad shout had swelled up and died away again, to Sam's final and complete satisfaction and pure joy, a minstrel of Gondor stood forth and knelt and begged leave to sing. And behold, he said, I will sing to you of Frodo of the Nine Fingers and the Ring of Doom." Which for me goes, like with Morgoth, back to the First Age, but this time to Beren and his loss, which, like with Morgoth, affects a whole hand and not just a finger. Beren strode forth, and in his right hand he held aloft the Silmaril, which he cut from that iron crown of Morgoth. But Carcharoth looked upon that holy jewel and was not daunted, and the devouring spirit within him awoke to sudden fire, and gaping he took suddenly the hand within its jaws, and he bit it off at the wrist. Thereafter Beren was named Erchamion, which is the one-handed, and suffering was graven in his face. He too suffers like Frodo does, but his loss also speaks of victory, both of the Silmaril taken from Morgoth, as well as, and more importantly I would say, the union achieved between Beren the man and Luthien the elf. And I would say too that this comparison to Beren is far from an unfair one, since back at the Council of Elrond, after Frodo says he will take the ring, Elrond tells him, "I will say that your choice is right, and though all the mighty elf friends of old, Hador and Hurin and Turin and Beren himself were assembled together, your seat should be among them." Frodo will not get a book named after him, any more than he will get his finger back. But I can't imagine he would want that. The finger, probably. The book, definitely not. Sauron, meanwhile, who would want a book named after him, I'm sure, loses far more than a finger in the end. So does Gollum. Actually, he gains a finger, being the one that he bit off of Frodo, although he does not keep that very long. Neither does he keep the ring for long either, once he gets it back. But, while he was with us, he endured much, including, I say, the actual four-fingered black hand of Sauron. And so, it is his comment about that, which is one of the little things that I love in The Lord of the Rings. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful day.